All right, so this next section is about embryo culture. Embryo culture. So sometimes when you're producing seed or producing new plants for plant breeding, the embryo might have some problems. It doesn't want to grow with the particular genetics that you have put together. The mother and the father plant that you've tried to cross, they give you a living embryo, but that embryo doesn't want to grow. And so there are some kinds of problems that you might run into. And as long as you can get past the initial hurdle of growing that embryo once, you can then keep growing it through some kind of clonal process. And potatoes is an example of that because with potatoes, once you have a potato plant and it produces the kind of potatoes you want, if the potatoes growing vigorously, making beautiful potatoes, to grow next season's potatoes, all I have to do is save some of these potatoes from this year and I'll grow them next year. Just put them in storage in a good, nice, cool storage. And I've got seed potatoes, as they call them, and they are perfect clones of what I grew last year. Maybe there are embryos that don't even have the endosperm tissue that's necessary to grow into a plant, and I need that extra energy. So I need to go to some great lengths to grow this plant. Some orchids require embryo culture in order to get them to grow. And for some horticultural plants, they can be worth hundreds of dollars a piece or more, and so the effort to do this is actually quite worthwhile. So now I've got seed. I can either direct seed into the field, and sometimes you can use raw seed or pelletized seed. Pelletized seed, you've coated it with some sort of a clay material that helps in seed handling and might even include some other nutrients or probably fungicides to keep the seed healthy while it is germinating and still extremely vulnerable at that tiny seedling stage. The fungicide is there to give it a little higher percentage chance at the beginning of its growth. Generally, we mechanically plant seed. It can be hand planted, but that's more labor intensive. And there are different kinds of planters. There are uh, planters that separate out the single seeds using some sort of a belt. The ones I've used the most are called a Stanhay planter. Very, very useful in the industry, widely used all over the place in this valley. And there are also air planters that use little tiny discs with holes in them, or I should say discs with tiny holes. The discs aren't tiny, but as the discs spin through uh, a little hopper filled with seed, the discs have a vacuum sucking through these tiny holes, and the seed gets stuck to these tiny holes on the disc. And as the disc is spinning, the suction is removed momentarily and the seed falls down into the ground. So again, it's just engineering problems. How do I get the seed in the ground? But you can either do the direct seed in your field and plant seed, or you can transplant seeds that were started in the greenhouse. And so there are different kinds of mechanical transplanters out there and hand transplanters. Um, and we do a lot of transplanting of certain crops. Lettuce is one that we do both. We do direct seed and we do transplants, especially early on when it's not quite ready outside to plant. It's still too much winter, the ground's too wet. We're not ready to plant in the field, but we can get started in the greenhouse. So you start them in the greenhouse and then you transplant them in the field for that first round of planting, and you get a head start. You get extra time for growing in the season. Um, Now, where lettuce is very expensive in Europe, they transplant because the lettuce seed is too expensive. They don't want to put a whole bunch of seed out in the field and then thin out 2/3, 3/4 of their seed, killing all of those other plants. It's too expensive to kill that many seedlings because the seed is so dang expensive. So transplanting in Europe is done for all lettuce. Celery. I haven't seen celery seed planted in the field in years and years and years. We transplant all of it. So again, transplanting can be very, very useful. And some things are done transplanting of some sort of a clone, something like strawberries, where up in the areas near Mount Lassen, past Reading, up in the hills where it has a good winter conditions where strawberries like to make runners. They grow these runners in the field up in those cold areas, and they dig up these runners by the millions and box them up and send them here to transplant. Field seeding of herbaceous plants. Well, direct field seeding. Herbaceous plants, that's what mostly what we have in um, in the vegetable crops, things that are not woody. Indoor seeding and transplanting, mechanized seed production. There are huge operations for seed production where they will have very specific stages that they are monitoring in the production of these transplants. They look at the first part where the seed germinates and the radicle starts coming out, radical emergence. That's the first real visible sign after germination. Then the cotyledons spread if it's epigeous um, germination. Then they get up unfolding of the true leaves as the plant's growing, 3 to 4 leaves. Stage 4 is more than 4 true leaves. Now, where do you want to transplant? At what point? And so there's a lot of research, fine tuning exactly what's the best timing for a given crop, a given variety during a given time of year. And so there's these very specific steps that are being closely monitored to get ready for transplanting. You can look up plant tape. Plant tape. It is something that was developed in Europe, purchased by Tennemore and Antle here in the United States, and has been expanded greatly. I'm not sure if TNA has sole ownership or if they are just a partner in the organization, the plant tape organization, but it's another way to fine tune and reduce costs for transplanting. It's an amazing improvement in transplanting where it works, and they're getting better at it and expanding it to more crops all the time as their research is improving. So here we were talking about herbaceous plants at the top. Those are the non-woody. They're herbaceous or soft tissue versus the woody plants. Now, those are going to be different still. If I'm making uh, grape vines or apple trees or any other woody type of a crop, generally they're produced in some sort of containers. And again, there's lots of different ways of doing things. Every single crop is different. Now, I mentioned plant tape. Here's the links for a couple of plant tape uh, things you can look at on the web. You can see why they call it plant tape, because inside of each of these trays is actually a zigzag netted together or linked together set of these transplants that can then be mechanically pulled out by a machine and stuck into the ground very, very quickly with much less labor. Take a look. Here's another operation. You can just see this sea of seedlings inside of this greenhouse. You can tell just barely if you look at the edge of the upper left picture and the upper right portion of the upper left picture, you can see the edge of that internal greenhouse facility. And so these would then be taken to a transportation vehicle out to the field, placed into these trays, or the trays placed into a transplanting machine that might require some uh, significant labor. And then here's a transplanted field, and now we're coming through with the harvesting crew. So again, highly mechanized operations in vegetable production. So here's an operation, different kinds of seeds all have to be handled differently. This is an air planter set up to plant specifically in these trays. And you can see the trays laid out in the greenhouse, and finally the finished trays in the greenhouse that are ready to go either to the customer or to planting. Now I've shown you the 4 stages of plug production, so I'm not going to go over that again. But there are many different kinds of plugs for different uses. Very, very tiny plugs for these horticultural uses. This is not going to be something you see in vegetable crops. This is something that would be some type of floral, I'm sure. Um, Here's the mechanized seeder. Trees, very, very unique setup. Here's a guy doing the cone collection from some trees, bringing the cones in. The cones are being laid out. I don't know if they're being dried first, probably. Collecting the seeds from that, then they are setting them up in these trays. You can see for trees, they have these very, very long uh, cells in which they place the seeds, because the trees, many of them, if they hit the bottom of a small planting tray, the seed's going to start, the root is going to do something called a J root, and they'll get a signal that's really not good for producing a nice, tall, straight tree. And they'll grow short and twisted like they would if they were up in the high mountains in rocky territory. And if you don't want short, twisted trees, you want tall, straight trees for growing lumber or paper mill trees or whatever. You're growing trees for agricultural production. You want that root straight. You want that root never to touch bottom until you plant it, and it then never touches because now it's in the ground and it keeps going down. So you want these very different long trays, extremely different than what you want in some of these flowers. Something like petunias, they love it when their roots hit the bottom and their roots are all wrapped up. It helps induce flowering when you have the roots slightly impacted, slightly constrained. Every single plant has unique issues, unique challenges, unique things you have to do to make it work right. And so you need to know the biology of your plants. You need to know your seeds. You need to know the genetics. You need to know your temperatures and soil and water requirements and fertility requirements. Every one of them is different. And so you specialize thinking about certain crops. And it's kind of hard to know more than a handful really well. So growers around here, they might know their broccoli, cauliflower, spinach, strawberry routines, and lettuce, excuse me. Um, and they might know about some other things, but they really don't know the details. They wouldn't be a good asparagus grower until they get out there and do it, master it. There's a lot of details in every crop. So, seed propagation, tons of information.